Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get this show started a little bit early. The sooner we get done, the sooner we can get to drinking, which, of course, is the most important part of the day. So this is Better SIEM Notables, how to make your SIEM a little bit more situationally aware. And I am Jesse Throwe, currently an information security analyst at CoverMyMeds. A couple websites up there. The first one, a couple of job descriptions and whatnot. We are actively looking for a information security engineer. So if you're interested, you can always reach out to me or check out the website. We got a lot of cool stuff there. Scriptscribed is where we blog a lot of the interesting general tech things that we do. All the developers and infrastructure people have access to it, and we post whenever we do something kind of cool or interesting. Other than that, I've been kind of an all-around general geek, information security guy, systems engineer, developer. I've kind of waffled around for the last 20 years, which is honestly a little weird for me that it's been that long now. When I was doing this slide, I was like, really? It has been that long? Damn. So, the problem we have. SIEMs are incredibly useful tools. They're the kind of thing that when I was first an InfoSec guy, I really wanted. It was such a pain in the ass to manually go through logs on host and going through Snort, because it was still Snort at the time, and free. It was just a pain. And you usually would end up either tuning it out and ignoring it, or you spent most of your time pulling your hair out, and it was not fun. Fortunately, SIEMs came around, and you had an analytics platform, and life got a little bit better. Ultimately, computers are cheap. I can go buy a couple of servers for 10 or 20 grand, and they can churn for 5 years and give me a lot of very interesting information. Hiring more engineers is not cheap. You're spending at least 6 digits every year, and human needs. And of course, we are human, so we tend to fail a little bit more than computers do. There are, of course, some fundamental tasks that computers are good at that we don't really leverage properly in SIEMs. Personally, I blame the legacy of them being NIDs and HIDs where they came from for that reason. 20 years ago, when I first started playing with Snort, you spent 6 months tuning Snort so that it understood your environment, so that you could get non-false positives. Does this sound familiar? It should, because, hey, we do the same damn thing in 2015 with SIEMs. You spend 6 months tuning the damn thing so it doesn't give you false positives. It's been 20 years and we haven't improved. Now, I should say, tuning a SIEM is an important part of onboarding one. You have to configure it to be domain specific. The things that I do as a SAS at CoverMyMeds is not the same things I would do at previous companies. Different companies have different needs. If I were, say, a world-class sales site, I can't block by country. I can do that since we only do American onshored business. So if you come from China, I can immediately go, no, you're not valid traffic, and I know this because you're not from the US. So on and so forth. So those things you do have to tune. But the thing that always bugged me, and this is sort of a rant, sort of the point that we're going to dive into, tuning your SIEM ultimately can result in over-tuning your SIEM. Is the first example in particular that I'll get to in a little bit here will show the traditional solution is, well, N causes too many false positives, so we'll do 2N. Okay, yeah, that reduces your noise, but does it actually fix your problem? Well, maybe. Or maybe you could see some legitimate problems that are simply being put aside as noise. That could be an early indicator of a very real problem, usually someone in your network. One of the things that really struck me in 2015 with all of the attacks, one of the things that came out of it was the sheer amount of time that the attackers were in network. It wasn't like the good old days where usually your website got pwned and some kiddie put up, hey, you got pwned by LOL noobs, and you cleaned up your website, you closed the vulnerability, and life went on. You now have people who are in your network for an extended period of time, days, weeks, or even months. It gives you an extended period to detect them at any point in time and exfiltrate the vulnerability before they pull your data out of network. It's, of course, very poignant for me where I'm at now because PHI leaves our network and we have a very, very bad day. So your mileage may vary depending on what you do. Ultimately, I tend to lock SIEM notables into 3 tiers. You have the code red stuff, the active worms, viruses, attackers who are going through your network, and if you do not do something now, you're going to have a very, very bad day, probably involving re-imaging lots and lots of machines or losing lots and lots of data. Some of my peers here have, of course, experienced that firsthand. These are the kind of things that you generally want to be woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning for, so you can stop it before it reaches, 50, 100% of your environment. There are the notable stuff, the general churn, and this is the stuff that I'm really focused on today. These are the things that could be ultimately really bad, but they're not right now. They're the things that require human intervention. And what I've noticed in most modern SIEMs is this is the bulk of your activity. There are very, very few things that pop out red. And depending on your SIEM, it doesn't support non-notable events. If it does, they're usually pretty low. These are the things that your SOC or NOC or your InfoSec team will need to review, look at, go, yes, this is a false positive. No, this is an actual thing. We now need to take action X, Y, or Z. Re-image a machine, talk to that user who just clicked on that phishing email and lost their freaking password, so on and so forth. And then you have the non-notable notables. It's a little bit of a double negative. Let me explain. They're the events that aren't really notable on their own. They're things that could ultimately become an event, but aren't right now. Just because John Doe failed their password 3 times or 6 times or however many times doesn't necessarily make it a notable event. But if I look up John Doe's account, I want those events to pop up to the top immediately. I'm investigating that person for a reason. I'm looking at that account because something weird probably happened. So the fact that he failed his password is something I'm going to want to know. So having those in your SIEM becomes very handy because your SIEM can go, hey, I know I logged a bunch of activity that I didn't think was important at the time, but you should now look at. Like I said, some SIEMs don't even have this really option. If it becomes a notable, it pushes it out to the bloody page and you have to then review it and mark it, which I personally find to be a bit of a fallacy myself. You usually also assign scores to these things. I've seen everything from info to critical to 1 to 5 to 1 to 10. For today's examples, I'm going to use a 1 to 10 system where 1 to 3 is a non-notable, 4 to 7 is a notable, and 8 to 10 is a, oh, holy crap, it's a bad day. So, first example. And honestly, this is the one that got me to start working on this talk. I've worked on QRadar, I've worked on Splunk, I've worked on Alien Vault, and now I'm actually writing my own inside the Elk stack. Every single bloody one of them has produced this alert, which drives me up a frickin' wall. I do not care on its own that John Doe, or Jay Smith in this case, failed to log into my bloody mail server 3 times. I call them context-free notables because there's so much data that could be garnered around it that we don't currently collect. And this also shows why tuning a SIEM becomes a problem. Normally, and this is something I've had to do, not happily, you go, well, I'm getting too many bloody alerts when it's set to 3 or 5 or 20 or whatever. So let's turn it up. Let's tune out the noise. We assume that it's noise, but we could do more with it. So let's assume that this, in our hypothetical SIEM, generates a baseline risk of 5. Right now, that would be something that would generate a yellow notable. Your InfoSec team or your SOC, depending on the time of day and how your responses are, will have to look at it and look up Jay Smith's account and go from there. Figure out whether this was somebody fat-fingered their account, whether Imprivata decided to go out of sync and hammer their password over and over and over again, or whether, hey, someone's actually trying to probe this account. So some potential additional sources of data that we could use to do more with this context-free notable. We can look at your AD or LDAP or whatever weird authentication, central authentication system that you use. Hopefully you use one. If not, you should. And you should look at this and go, hey, when does this user change their password? It is amazing the number of times, and to be honest, I've even fallen victim to this myself once or twice, that I've changed my password on a Thursday. Friday, you're good. You go through a weekend, you forget. You forget that you changed it. You forget what it is. You type it in a bunch of times. You know, this is something you can look at and go, oh, well, you know, it's the Monday following a weekend where a user changed their password. This is very likely to not be a notable event. Maybe it is, but it becomes a source of data. Is this a valid user? Is this an active user? If this is an inactive account and suddenly they're hitting your external email server after being inactive for a month or two, it's the kind of thing that you should raise the score on. 5 isn't good enough. It should probably be an 8, and you should be waking people out of bed why this inactive account has suddenly gone live, especially since they're usually service accounts. You can look at VPN, email, etc., type of authentication logs. I like to use this, especially email, and if you have it in external OA. External OA is a fabulous way of figuring out IPs associated to user accounts, even on things like their phone. You have your most paranoid users. They're not going to link into ActiveSync. They're going to probably use OA, especially if they're technical. Doesn't matter. You can log the IP. You can associate that device to that user, at least within a reasonable level of certainty. Same thing with VPN. Although VPN is a little less common, usually limited to just your technical people. So it's a little less useful. But OA, oh my god, OA is a fabulous mine of information. Is the IP that the user's failing login from associated to an IP that you've seen this user track before? And if you have a ACID database or NAC or that kind of thing, you can even tie that into that and go, hey, is this their on-site NAC'd IP or not? This kind of thing, you can modify the score and go, hey, I know this IP, so again, it's more likely that they just fat-fingered their password. Vice versa, if it's suddenly coming from China, might want to wake up people. Other random source of information, you can, of course, look up GeoLight, which I, of course, kind of sort of keep referring to by going, hey, where's this IP coming from? Because SIEMs are really cool computational machines, you can go, hey, am I seeing a pattern? Am I seeing an attempted login every 61 seconds, or 120, or 13, or 13 to 15, or something like that, especially for large numbers of failed logins. This lets you start to figure out, hey, is it a human or not? Humans, if you watch human behavior when they mess up their password after, say, a weekend, will usually type their password in twice, very, very quickly. They'll go, do-do-do-do. Well, that didn't work. They'll do it again. So you'll have like a 10, 15-second delay. You'll have a little bit more of a delay, and then you'll have a long delay. And if you think about it, psychologically, they're going, is that the right password? I can't remember. You'll end up with this nice exponential drop-off. It's the kind of thing you can look at to go, am I dealing with a human being or am I dealing with a bot? Especially here, we're worried about brute forcing. So, a couple of breakdowns of this example. In my original talk, I actually called this method Bayesian filtering. It's not entirely true, because Bayesian filtering is actually based upon the word count per blah, blah, blah. You could actually roll it into certain things. In a more general case for this, I'm just calling this in general score modification. So let's say Mr. Smith failed to log into the mail server 3 times in the last 60 seconds from an IP. We start with our baseline of 5. We look at AD. The user changed their password last Wednesday, and it's now Monday. there's a very high likelihood that they probably forgot their password, so we drop the score by 1. We look at the prior auth, and the IP is from a known external email or VPN log, so we drop it by another 1. Now we're down to 3. All of a sudden, this becomes a non-notable event. We look at the geo IP information, and hey, we know the IP, but it's not close to the office, so let's bump the score a little bit. And now let's look at the login pattern. The login pattern follows that humanistic behavior of external drop-off. So we go, hey, this most likely is a human. We drop the score by 0.5. And we end up with 3. It's a non-notable event on its own. Again, by it being a non-notable notable, if something else happens, let's say we get a lot more logins, or there's some other anomalous activity, and we generate a yellow, this failed login becomes something that we look at. And then we change our mode of thinking from, hey, user fat-fingered their password, to, hey, user's machine may be compromised, and we might want to send someone out to have it re-imaged. Or tell them that they got pwned if they're using a personal device and quit trying to log into corporate email with it. We have another example here. This one, we start with 5 again. We look at AD. Password wasn't changed anytime recently, so we don't modify the score. We look at the prior auth. It's not modified. Again, we don't modify the score. And again, the cool thing about this kind of technique is you can modify it based upon your business's needs. If you are a company that has a very, let's say you're smaller, you're very, very small, you generally will know the IP spaces that your users come in from if they're external. You can change this to go, hey, if I don't know this IP, it's really likely that it's not a valid person, and you can bump it up appropriately. But the cool thing is it becomes a lot more customizable for your business needs. It enables and empowers you when you're tuning your SIEM, rather than making the frustration of, I have 400 notable events, and they're all that my users bloody well fail to log into their systems. And I'm spending 8 hours a day figuring out that they're all false positives, or, because we're all humans, what you'll inevitably do, you just click them all and you make them go away, which is not good either. Rant aside, we look at the IP, it shows it being far away, so we modify the score again, and we look at it, and we show it being outside the US, so we increase the score. We look at the login pattern, and there is a repeating pattern. So we go, hey, this is most likely a bot brute forcing, attempting to brute force at least our accounts. It becomes a critical event, a high-end, non-critical notable event. It's the kind of thing that you don't want to wake people up at night because, well, if you're any real reasonable-sized company, let's face it, you're going to have lots of login attempts. It sucks, it fills your logs, but such is life. But it's the kind of thing that you may want to deal with later. Depending on your company's policy, you might just blacklist that IP address, depending on what your business's needs are. If you're a large sales website, you're a lot less likely to do that because you don't want to risk losing business. If you're, say, a large healthcare provider in central Ohio, well, you might inconvenience a doctor or two, but life will go on. Example 1.3. This one I'm changing the thing up a little bit. So we have that failed login, and then we have a successful login. We iterate through the same things that we saw in 1.2. So we end up with this non-critical notable event. But then we, shortly after, get a successful login. And this is where things get kind of cool. In modern SIEMs, I have not seen one yet that, by default, or without a lot of manual work, will generate a critical event from this. This is the kind of thing you want to be woken up from. This is an indicator that someone has broken into at least some part of your environment. This is a bad thing. But we don't generate that second alert. We don't generate that red. We generate that yellow. So the next morning, your team comes in and they go, hey. And unless they're paying attention, they get rid of it. If they're paying attention, or if you have your SIEM helpfully going, hey, I have a problem. A real problem. then they can go, hey, I need to immediately deactivate this user's account and force them to reset before any information can be pulled out of the network. So this becomes a really powerful tool that we have in our toolbox that we generally currently don't. And again, you can, especially with Splunk. Splunk, I will fully admit I'm biased. I love Splunk as a SIEM. I can do all sorts of wonderful, evil things inside of it with the right data. And I can technically make it do that. But out of the box, it doesn't do it. None of the other ones really do either. So, moving on, another type of example. And this is another one that I get a whole crap ton of. And let's face it, if you have a web server out on the internet, you get so tired of seeing the number of blah 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 / WP admin blah or blah 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 default IDA, although those aren't as frequent as they used to be. But if you guys have been web server admins, you know the patterns. They're constant. They're annoying. Either way, if you have your web server logs forwarded to your SIEM like you should, it will of course generate alerts because, hey, this matches a known attack of a worm. And especially if you've got something scanning it, it'll go, hey, alert, alert. Now this gets to be a little more funky. Unlike the previous example, generally we will correctly see this as somebody scanning and picking up our network. But we can still do some cool things to this, mostly in the other direction. Normally it's going to be noise that I want to pay attention to, but if we pull from some extra sources of data, in particular, if we pull from our DSIM or our asset database, and hopefully, yes, you have a updated DSIM or asset database, don't you? If not, you should be yelling at your server admins. Look up the asset database and go, hey, what OS is this thing? Because obviously your SIEM is intelligent enough to go, hey, I know that this is a WordPress vulnerability or a code red or whatever, insert the new hot HTTP-based thing of the day. Is this host vulnerable? Is the app, and if the OS is correct, is the app even installed? If I'm getting something.php and I don't have PHP on my bloody web server, I really don't care at the end of the day. And you want all of those notable events rolled up into one big giant, hey, someone is probing the network. You should probably be aware of this, but it's not something I need to wake you up in the middle of the night for. The other one, and this is what I'm currently fighting with, the damn thing is not smart enough to detect that it's scanning itself. So you have your vulnerability scanner properly doing regular scans, and it, of course, generates a whole crap ton of SIEM alerts because, hey, you're looking at people trying to log in with default credentials and doing all these bad things because that's what your vulnerability scanner is supposed to do. That's not smart enough to go, hey, this is your vulnerability scanner IP, not an external one. Again, and then you come in after the weekend of having your vulnerability scanner, Qualys or OpenVAS or whatever, do its scanning, it generates its report, and you log into your SIEM and you've got 500 bloody notable events all over the environment. It's a whole lot of noise, and it's not helpful. It's painful, and it, unfortunately, and this is where it drives me nuts, it clouds the potentially important things. If you're spending all this time dealing with this noise, you can't spend the time dealing with the half a dozen things that you really need to spend some time on. So, a couple of examples here. So let's say it's one of my favorites, the WordPress admin vulnerability. There's 400 million of them, so the payload will vary some. So we start with our baseline of 6. It looks at the vulnerability DB and it goes, hey, this is a WordPress vulnerability. And then we look at the DSIM and it goes, oh, hey, you know what? We don't have WordPress. So, yeah, someone's doing something bad, but, we don't care. And more importantly, if you start doing this kind of analysis, you can get your SIEM to roll all those scans up. So rather than having 20 notable events from 20 different fucking web servers going, I got scanned! It can go, hey, this source scanned all these IPs. One notable event. Click it. Make it go away. Life is quicker. It's amazing how much UX can come into play. Example 2.2. This one's a little older. I couldn't find a more recent variant of Windows. I'm personally a Linux guy myself, so insert more modern Windows wormy IIS thing here. But let's assume that it's code red and you're, for whatever bloody reason, running an ancient version of Windows. So it looks at the vulnerability DB and goes, hey, this is code red. And then it looks at the DSIM and goes, hey, we're running Windows 2000 because we don't have any regulations. We don't have HIPAA or whatever, SOX or PCI. So this could be a really bad day. You might want to wake up and go check your web server and make sure you didn't just get pwned. Generate a red alert. And this is the big difference here. The first one, we're not vulnerable. We don't care. This one, we are potentially vulnerable. We do care. We want woken up potentially, or whatever your incident response is. If you're big enough, you have a SOC, it's always on site, and we'll do it for you. The third example, and this one gets to be a little bit more fun. It's some variant of some PHP vulnerability. I pulled a random one, the PHP CGI information disclosure. So it's not really a horrible day if you are. Do the same kind of thing. It looks at the vulnerability DB and goes, hey, this is CVE 2012-1823. It looks at your DSIM and goes, hey, whoa, this is a bad day. You've got PHP on these guys. So it modifies the score up. Let's say this is a Linux box running RPM, some Red Hat or CentOS variant. RPMs support in the changelog CVEs. So if your DSIM is doing its job, it's going to extract that information when you do patches, or you're going to run satellite, or SUSE Studio, whatever the hell they're calling it these days. They seem to want to change their name every year or two. Either way, you can look at that sorts of information for your patching strategy. And you can go, hey, yes, I am running PHP, but I know for a fact, based on my changelog, or my satellite information, that CVE 2012-1823 has been patched on those hosts. So while we are running PHP, we are not vulnerable. So you end up with 7. Now this becomes kind of weird. Why did I drive towards 7? It's not wake me up in the middle of the night, but something that first thing in the morning my InfoSec team is going to look at. We can only be so reasonably assured that we're patched. Maybe there's a new variant, which it's actually kind of amusing because if you pull up 1823, there's like 4 or 5 CVEs attached to it because they iterated over it and found various, hey, you patched this one, but if you do this, you can leak this information or crash the server or all sorts of interesting things. So it's the kind of thing that I'm going to want to look at first thing in the morning. I'm going to want to make sure my host wasn't compromised anyways, whatever incident response program you have for that. So example 3, we're going to get a little more fun here. I'll be honest, I haven't entirely solved this one. SIEM gets an event from your NIDS. Oh my god, it's talking on port 6667. Usually it shows up in your SIEM as a CNC botnet of some variety, Zeus, or it's a generic one. Either way, this one drives me nuts. Why does it drive me nuts? Well, currently where I work at, we actually use IRC, so I can't just block port 6667. If you guys don't use IRC at your company, great, you can just ignore it, block it at the firewall, life goes on. But what about if you do? Or, from a previous place, it wasn't necessarily IRC, but there was a company bot vendor product that communicated over, yes, port 666-7, and it would generate alerts. Why? It doesn't look. You're already looking at the packet. Look at it and tell me if it's something useful. So I thought for this one we could have a little bit of fun and get some audience participation. So for this one, I'll go back to it. What sources of data could we pull from? How could we potentially mitigate or dive into it and figure out whether or not this is a notable event? Ding! We could dive into the packet and go, hey, am I sending weird gibberish on some weird IRC channel, or is it somebody logging in and joining, # puppet? Where's another one? There's a good example. You can tell, hey, is this coming from my workstation network or my server network? If it's from my server network, it's probably a bad day, unless you've got, VDI or jump host or something like that. But again, it's domain specific. We'll throw out another one there. This IP, not actually random. This is an IP for chat.freenode.net. It's Freenode. You can look at your DNS database and go, hey, is this a legitimate IRC server? Is it coming from, Freenet or FNet or, Undernet or whatever? Are they still even out there? I know Freenode is, though. Or is this going to some, Joe Bob's IRC server in China? I keep picking on China. So again, you can modify score from there. Any other ideas? There's at least one more that I've already thought of, so we can join from the previous example for our email or VPN logs and go, hey, well, not so much VPN because we're assuming they're on-prem. Here's a good example. How fast is the data? Are they joining in and suddenly sending a flood of data? Or because it's unencrypted, are they sending what looks like regular old English? Is there a pattern? Very good example, by the way. Network patterns. Yes, it's a very good example. We will have users who use IRC are probably regularly IRC users. They are communities after all. I will pivot on that one a little bit. Generally, you're not going to have your salespeople logging into IRC. You can look in AD and see, hey, is this user a developer? If they're not a developer, I'm probably going to be a little bit more concerned why they're using IRC. I manage a herd of them, so, yeah. So they're all very interesting things to do. And so the whole point of this talk is to start to get people thinking about, hey, let's think beyond. There we go. SIEMs are incredibly useful, but let's think beyond them a little bit about how they work currently, rather than just have it look through your logs, do a little correlation, and go, something weird happened. We can dive a little bit deeper. We can give it some context. And that context is incredibly useful at filtering out the needle from the stack of needles. You're only going to have so many security engineers or analysts working so many hours a day looking at problems. So even if your SIEM is generating notables, more notables than they can handle, if you're percolating the really important ones to the top, at least they can work on the ones that will cause the most impact. Preferably, they're clearing out the queue and you end up with 0 notables because, it's actually a reasonable amount of work, but hey, we don't live in utopia, so yay. Personally, pet peeve, while I consider the traditional wisdom of tuning the SIEM is a useful part of it, it is not a holistic solution that so many SIEM providers seem to want to just tout on you. Spend the 6 months and dedicate an engineer to it, and your SIEM will be awesome. Yes, it could be really handy, but it's not a panacea. And like I said, I really would like us to start thinking about changing our approach for how we handle SIEMs in the next generation. Splunk's a really good start. Talk earlier today I was talking about ELK. Personally, that's where I'm diving into. We don't have the multi-million-dollar budget to buy Splunk, so hey, let's roll our own. So these are things that I'm thinking about rather poignantly because they're problems that we're facing rather head-on. So Q&A time. Anyone got questions, comments, answers, blah, blah, blah?
So let's say we come in and start all these modules, and you get tons of technical experience. Where do you start? You got greens and blues and reds and yellows. Do you turn everything off and just turn one thing on, or do you where do you start if no one knows what's going on with this happening?
Personally, I like to start small. I like the onion theory. You onboard a data source. Personally, I've had the most luck onboarding network initially, mostly because every network device on the planet talks either SNMP or syslog. So you make a syslog data source and you throw all your firewalls and your network traffic at it, and it gives you a whole lot of data that you can parse through, but it's largely controlled. When you get further out, web servers and whatnot, you start getting lots of variant in your data, especially if they've, say, customized your Apache logs. It gets to be kind of fun really quick. So that's how I would start. I would start one bit at a time. Also, one of the things I like to do is I won't throw it at production first. I'll have a test cluster off to the side that I can point these things at. I can start to see what the data looks like. So, you know, say it's a network device, you're going to have traffic. If it's a smart network device, you're going to have some threat data, or some NetFlow data, or SFlow if you're Juniper, or JFlow, or whatever the heck they use. You're going to have config changes. Network devices have authentication logs. A lot of people forget that. You're going to want to go, hey, are we failing authentication to our network device? Are there changes? You know, this gets to be a little less security thing, but Splunk sells you like a Coke dealer. They go, hey, we'll give you a little bit of data for free, and you can onboard a couple of things. And then once you're kind of hooked, they go, hey, you can onboard all these other data sources, and you can pull in all the other companies. Now, you know, think of it as you will. It's actually kind of a cool idea to think about, though. Outside the security space, more in the change management space, if you're already logging your network devices changes, you can trap for those and correlate to your change system if there's a change on those devices and throw up an alert to the change guys and go, hey, somebody just pushed a change to your switches, your switch fabric in the middle of the day. You might want to go talk to the network team and find out why. So from that perspective, while I consider a SIEM a security-focused solution, it's really not entirely. It also allows you to get buy-in and sometimes engineering effort, which makes life a little bit easier for everyone, unless you want to be an expert in every kind of log type out there. Trust me, you don't. Next question. Bueller. Some of them, yes, I have. In particular, the Active Directory ones in the previous organization, I did have AD hooked up to it. The problem with Splunk in that, in particular, it becomes very difficult to do score modification intrinsically. You build the rule and you assign it a score at the end of the rule, so what you end up doing is you build this giant IIF block set around it, and you end up duplicating a lot of rules. So it works, you can get to it, and like I said early on, a lot of these examples, some SIEMs can do it to certain degrees. None of them do it particularly well yet. Splunk, honestly, is one of the best ones I've seen on it, though. It still needs some work on that. I'm sure if you plugged in some modules, you could probably get it to do it. I did not dive in that deeply on that. But I did do a bunch of LDAP stuff to kind of go, hey, when was PWD last set, and kind of generate some rules from there. Anybody else? Okay, well, I will be floating around the rest of the afternoon. If you want to know anything about me, talk about SIEMs, or talk about covering my meds, you can always grab me or the pony-tailed guy in the back there. Mr. Warner is one of our other cover my meds recruiter or employee types. So, thank you much.